I've been involved in a number of the main developments in translation studies over the what is it now, 35 years of my career, and so that may give you some insight into what has been going on, my perspective on it. But also, I come from a time where there were no degrees in translation. Nobody, well, I don't know. In 1983, I got my PhD in English with a doctoral dissertation on American literature, and that was published in 1985. At that time, I believe I could not have gotten a PhD in translation or translation studies. And for many years, that was frustrating for me in the U.S. because in the U.S., translation studies professors are hired by foreign language. So if you have a PhD in Spanish, say, and translate from Spanish to English, you can get a job teaching translation studies in a Department of Modern Languages. My foreign main source language is Finnish. I lived in Finland for 14 years, and I still translate quite a bit from Finnish. And I have held a job, an associate professorship in Finnish English translation theory and practice at the University of Tampere from 1987 to 1989. And then I moved to the US. And until I got my current job at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, Shenzhen, I have been an English professor. Now, this is my last job. I will retire from this job in 2.5 years. And so my second job as a professor was in translation studies, and my last job as a professor will be in translation studies. But most of my career has been in English. So anyway, let's go back. I wanted to be an exchange student after high school, and I applied to Germany and got accepted. And then a month before I was supposed to leave, they called and said, "We're very sorry. Germany has lowered their quota to 30. You're number 44. Would you rather go to Finland or Holland?" And I said, "Holland." They said, "Okay, you're going to Holland." 1 week before I was supposed to leave, they called and said, "We're so sorry about this, but Holland is out. Are you willing to go to Finland?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "You're leaving today." So I was 16 years old. I spent 13 months in Finland. I learned Finnish fluently, and I loved it there, and I decided I would live there the rest of my life. I had to go back to the US for 2 years, the visa requirements, and as soon as I could, I went back to Finland, finished my university degree there, and at the age of 20, got hired as an acting junior lecturer of English at the University of Jyvaskyla. Within 2 years, I believe, I was appointed to I got job security in that position. And I ended up doing that job during that time, the English department, the main office, would get phone calls from other people in the university saying, "Do you have anyone who translates from Finnish to English?" Since I was the only native speaker of English with fluent Finnish, the secretary would come to me. "Are you willing to do a translation?" I'd say, "Yes." What I discovered was that I loved translating. It was an absolute thrill for me. So I translated things from the university and then increasingly from the community, from the city, for those 5 years. And in about 1979 or 1980, I decided I really needed to go back to the US to get a PhD. And as I was making plans to do that, it occurred to me that it might be nice to know whether anybody had ever written anything about translation. Maybe someday I might want to write about translation. I tucked that away. I went to the U.S. I got my PhD in English, wrote a dissertation on American literature, came back, had a job in Finland. I was on leave and I returned to Finland, although I didn't return to my actual job. I took further leave from that job in order to work as an acting associate professor of English at the University of Tampere in 1983. And I revised my dissertation, got it accepted for publication, and at that point I thought, now's the time to go check to see if anyone has ever written about translation. So I went to the university library, and there were about 10 or 12 books on the shelves about translation. Most of them did not look very promising. They were often badly published. They were not really addressing major issues. They were like suggested exercises for translation and so on between Finnish and English. But one of the books on the shelf then was George Steiner's After Babel. It had been published in 1975 by Oxford University Press. This was 1984 or so, it'd been around for 9 years. I checked that out, I read it, and I absolutely loved it. I was thrilled by that book. I liked it so much that I read it a second time immediately. And that was really my graduate education in translation studies, literary hermeneutical translation studies. And for many, many years, as a translation scholar, I called myself a hermeneutical scholar of translation because of George Steiner. It was so powerful for me that I immediately started getting ideas for writing my own things. And the first thing I wrote was a bilingual book in Finnish and English, an experimental book written by first in English and then translated. I translated it myself into Finnish, and as I translated it, I kept thinking of my Finnish audience and how my Finnish audience would pull me in different directions. And so I would sometimes deviate from the English text in order to explore the Finnish side of things, and then gradually try to drag the Finnish back into alignment with the English. And I published that. I didn't publish it. I photocopied it. I made 10 copies and handed it out to friends, and they started coming back to me saying, could you make 5 more? My friends want some. And I ended up making a total of maybe 30 or 40. And we had a colloquium on it in about 1985 or 86. And it turns out there are 5 copies of the 30 or so I made in Finnish libraries, university libraries now. They have survived. And I have some on my own shelf as well. But based on that book, which never got published, the Finnish academic publishing industry was rather primitive at the time and very conservative. And so what I was doing was sort of out of their wheelhouse, and nobody wanted to publish it. So it remained unpublished. But then based on that book, I got appointed to an associate professorship of Finnish English translation theory and practice at the University of Tampere. I did that for 2 years, as I mentioned before. One of my colleagues was Justa Holtz-Mantteri. Justa Holtz was one of the founders of Skopos theory. In 1984, her dissertation was defended. She defended it in Finland. Her husband, somebody Mantteri, I never met him, so I don't know if they were still married, but her name was Justa Holtz, her German name, and then Mantteri was at the end, Holtz-Mantteri. Anyway, I got to know her very well. She was my colleague in the department. I learned about Skopos theory from her. She was good friends with Hans Vermeer. She brought him in several times to give guest lectures. Justa had almost no English, so she and I spoke Finnish. Hans Vermeer was fluent in English, so he and I spoke English. My German is passable, but not exactly conversational. I can read in it well. Anyway, during those 2 years at the University of Tampere as associate professor of Finnish English translation theory and practice, I cannibalized my bilingual book as The Translator's Turn. The Translator's Turn was published in 1991, actually the last week of 1990, with a 1991 publication date. And I was sure that this book that I was so weird, so strange, so different from anything anyone else had written about translation, that was probably unpublishable, like that first one. And so I went to in the U.S., Johns Hopkins University Press, who had published my dissertation, and to my surprise, they took it. They accepted it. And I thought, okay, well, that's nice, you know. But Johns Hopkins was not, and has never been, a translation studies press. And so I thought, okay, so it's being published by a writing for. I was writing it for myself, really. And I just met my PhD students this morning over Zoom, and told them this is a similar story, saying you have to write for an audience, except that my first book on translation, The Translator's Turn, I did not write for an audience. I just got lucky. Well, sort of lucky and unlucky at the same time, because there was a double response to that book. The top people like Gideon Toury, Theo Hermans, Andre Lefebvre, they attacked it. Lawrence Venuti, he was just getting started then, but they all attacked it. They thought it was absurd, it was stupid, it was amateurish, and so on. But it turned out, to my good fortune, there was a secondary audience that was less well placed. They were not full professors. They had not published on translation, but they were typically translators who were also just getting started as assistant professors in various universities around the world. They had no institutional prestige or power, but somehow, I have no idea how, they found this book. They picked it up, and by word of mouth, the reputation of that book spread around the world, and to my great surprise, I started getting invited around the world to give guest lectures and workshops on translation. By the time that book was published, I had already left Finland. I was in the U.S. I worked in the U.S. from 1989 to 2010 at the University of Mississippi, and at that time, it seemed to me there was no translation studies in the U.S. at all. There's not much now. There's more now than there was in 1989, but not much. I started going to American Translators Association conferences, started meeting other translators, project managers, agency owners, and a handful of translation scholars. And by the end of that decade, around 1997 or 98, I started thinking, I'd been to an EST conference, European Society of Translation Studies, and to a CATS conference, Canadian Association for Translation Studies. And so I started thinking, we need an American Translation Studies Association, ATSA. So I created a listserv for all the American translation scholars that I had gotten to know through ATA, American Translators Association, and we started meeting, discussing things on the listserv and meeting at ATA meetings and conferences. And in 2002, we created that society, that association. A few years later, the name was changed to the American Translation and Interpreting Studies Association. Now it's ATISA. We started the journal. It ended up being quite an influential journal. But I used to joke back in those days that I had to leave the country to be a translation scholar, because there just wasn't anything going on in translation studies at the time. I should mention that my Translator's Turn had been caught up in what was then being called the cultural turn in translation studies. And I enthusiastically threw myself into that. I started reviewing cultural studies, cultural turn books in translation studies, and I published 2 more books in the 90s. I published Translation and Taboo in 96, and then my textbook, Becoming a Translator, and my anthology, Western Translation Theory from Herodotus to Nietzsche, in 1997, plus 2 other books. And then I guess that was it for the 90s. But by 1999 or 2000, I was starting to get tired of the cultural turn. And what really sort of was the turning point for me was that I was sent an essay collection by the University of Massachusetts Press to vet for publication. And I recommended publication. It was a very well-written book by 10 or 12 translation scholars. But what I noticed reading that book for the press was that every single one used exactly the same paradigm, which was the cultural turn, right? So it wasn't surprising, but in the 80s, when I was getting started, the linguists were in charge, and we were trying to overthrow that. We were trying to shift translation studies from the linguistic study of equivalence, semantic equivalence, dynamic equivalence, whatever, to an approach to translation studies that takes culture into consideration, especially things like feminism and postcolonialism. And by the late 90s, that had happened. The cultural turn had completely ousted the linguists. The linguists began to turn to critical discourse analysis, Norman Fairclough, to talk about ideology linguistically, to make linguistics more like the cultural turn. As a result of my disaffection, I pulled out of translation studies for most of the first decade of the 21st century. I was doing rhetoric and semiotics and comparative literary theory. Oh, and writing studies. But at some point, I got an idea for a book and started writing it on translation. And that became Translation and the Problem of Sway, which was not published until 2011. By that time, I'd already moved to Hong Kong. I moved to Hong Kong in 2010. And that was really the beginning of my workaholic approach to translation studies. Translation studies is really, really hot in Greater China, mainland China, Hong Kong, and Macau. In Taiwan, not so much, but in mainland China and Hong Kong and Macau, translation studies is one of the hottest subjects around. And so I came into that with a bit of a reputation and was immediately caught up in the excitement. There was so much going on in translation studies, so many conferences, so many guest lectures, so much discussion of translation at various universities. I was invited to mainland China 4 or 5 times a year to give guest lectures. Every time I would arrive at a lecture in mainland China, the excitement was palpable. I was like a rock star. It was amazing to me. In the US, as a translation scholar, I had been nothing, nobody. Some people remembered the work I had done in literature, but in Hong Kong, I was a star, and Greater China generally. And that sort of accelerated my work in the field. So I began to write a lot more and publish a lot more in translation studies, including in 2013, which was the 200th anniversary of Friedrich Schleiermacher's über die verschiedenen Methoden des Übersetzens. I wrote and published Schleiermacher's Icoses in the bicentennial year. The first book-length commentary on Schleiermacher's Academy address in English, or I believe any language, at the time. 2 years later, in 2015, I published The Tao of Translation, drawing on ancient Chinese thought and applying it to translation. In 2016, I was asked to review a book. That book turned into an article. That review turned into an article. The article turned into a book called Translating Peirce on the semiotics of translation through Peircean eyes, but also applied to the translation of Peirce and of Wittgenstein. In 2017, I published those 4 books that Malgorzata mentioned, Exorcising Translation Towards Intercivilizational Turn, which was basically an engagement with Sakai Naoki, who mentioned that, because he's a Japanese theorist, and he has an article saying that Asian theory is taken to be a contradiction in terms, because Asians can't theorize and theorists can't be Asian. And he is obviously a very influential, very powerful Asian theorist. And he used the image of the Asian theorist as a kind of ghost or haunt. And so I wrote Exorcising Translation to explore that whole situation. And that was actually a split off of the book Critical Translation Studies, which is about Sakai Naoki and Lydia Liu, the Chinese theorist of translation, who is at Columbia. That same year, I published Aleksis Kivi and As World Literature. So after working on Peirce and then Asian translation theory, I turned to my personal wheelhouse, namely Finnish, translating from Finnish. Aleksis Kivi is Finland's first great novelist. He died in 1872. His 1870 novel, I was translating at the same time from 2015 to 2016. And so I wrote this monograph on translating Kivi alongside the translation I was doing. And then translationality, essays in the translational medical humanities. And that has been interesting lately because a British woman in Portugal named Karen Bennett read and was asked to review translationality. And in the conclusion to that book, she found my reference to what I called interepistemic translation. I said, in addition to Roman Jakobson's 3 types of translation, intralingual, interlingual, and intersemiotic, we need to have interepistemic translation between epistemic regimes or systems. And Karen Bennett turned that brief mention into a research project and enlisted me as a consultant. And that project is now off the ground and running. We just had our first inaugural conference on that in Lisbon in mid-December of last year. And that book, Translationality, turned out to be, it's on everybody's lips. Everybody at the conference mentioned it, discussed it. It was very exciting and flattering for me. Then in 2019, I published, actually this is an interesting story. I was invited to the Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand, by an Italian translation scholar named Marco Sonzogni. And he hired Michael Cronin and me to give keynote lectures on eco-translation or eco-translatology. Michael Cronin had just published his book, Eco-Translation, and I had published a book called The Deep Ecology of Rhetoric in Mencius and Aristotle, not about translation, but about rhetoric in an ecological context. And so Marco brought the two of us to New Zealand to talk about ecological approaches to translation. What he didn't tell us before we arrived, however, was that he had been unable to get proper funding with that topic. And so he shifted the topic to include transgender and other gender-related issues. So the very first session, I guess my keynote was the first in the conference, and then we had a 2.5-hour session on transgender, and it was transformative. It was transformative. I was really excited about it. I found so much in that session innovative and inspiring. And so at the end of the session, I went up to Marco and I said, "Marco, you never guess what happened." He said, "Oh, I can guess. You're going to write a book about it." And I said, "How did you guess?" He says, "Doug, I know you. I've read your work. This is the kind of thing you do." In fact, this is an interepistemic translation between translation studies and transgender studies, right? Two different epistemic systems, and I was exploring a bridge, an interepistemic bridge between them. So that came out in 2019, and Marco had me back down to New Zealand to launch it. I did a book launch down there, and it was very well attended. Apparently, Wellington, the capital of New Zealand, is also the capital of transgender existence and study in New Zealand, and so it was very well attended and got a very positive response. And then people say, "How can you possibly write 6 books a year?" Well, I don't. Sometimes at most 3 books a year, but never 6. But between 2019 and 2022, I published no books at all. So those got delayed. There was a lag in the publication of a number of books. So in 2022, I published The Strange Loops of Translation, another interepistemic translation between Douglas Hofstadter's Cognitive Science, in which he invents the term strange loops and develops strange loops as a model for the development of consciousness. And so, and Douglas Hofstadter is also a translator. He has translated Pushkin and 2 other books, I believe. I'm not remembering the name of he translated the other 2 from French, Pushkin from Russian. And he has written extensively on translation. He wrote a whole big, fat monograph called Le Tombeau du Marot in French on translation. And he invited me to his seminar, his doctoral seminar on translation studies, in around the same time that book came out, 1997, I believe it was, 98. So translation, The Strange Loops of Translation, is an attempt to explore an interepistemic middle ground between strange loops theory in cognitive science and translation. It was amazing to me reading back through Hofstadter's work, which I knew fairly well, but I hadn't read in several years. Looking back through it, it was amazing to me that he had not himself thought to apply strange loops to the study of translation. His work on translation was not particularly intelligent. His work on cognitive science is brilliant, world leading, and so on. but making the jump to translation studies was difficult for him, and so I decided I'd make it for him. And then last year, 6 books. Actually, the first 3 or 4 came out in 2022, but with a 2023 publication date. The first was Translation as a Form, the first book-length commentary on Walter Benjamin's Die Aufgabe des Übersetzers, the task of the translator, in English. There were 2 previous book-length commentaries on that essay, one in French by Antoine Bermond, one in German by Hans Vermeer. Fortunately, since I don't read French, Chantal Wright had translated the Bermond into English, but I got a copy of the German from a Turkish scholar who had worked with Vermeer on Benjamin, and I read the German commentary and published this first commentary, book-length commentary on Benjamin in July of 2022, which gave the book a chance to be picked up, found by Benjamin scholars all across Europe, and so I was invited to 2 different celebrations of the centennial of the 1923 publication of Die Aufgabe des Übersetzers. Then let's see. The behavioral economics of translation, an interepistemic translation between behavioral economics and translation. I began by reading Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, Thinking, Fast and Slow, and getting very excited about behavioral economics. And what I was originally planning to do was to talk about the difference between classical economics and behavioral economics in terms of rationalist versus irrationalist approaches to human decision making. Classical economics does posit the fundamental rationality of the economy, that because economic decision makers are rational in the aggregate, the economy is rational in the aggregate. And what Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky did in the 1970s in Jerusalem, where they were both professors, was to come up with a series of experiments. They would just run the experiments with whoever they could find. The experiments were all about decision making. A 1 in 50 chance of earning $100 or a 1 in 5 chance of winning $5, which would you take, or something like that. And what they found was that if you do the math for all these different experiments, they must have done hundreds of these experiments. If you do the math, one is likelier to give you a good result and therefore should be chosen. What they found was that people almost always chose the less rational choice, made the less rational choice, which is to say that human decision-making in the aggregate is not rational, but irrational. So they started publishing their findings, and classical economists started saying, well, you're just running these tests on stupid people. So they started running the tests on classical economists, and the classical economists had the exact same result. They too chose the irrational decision. And further, when these supposedly rational economists had to explain to them why their choice was irrational, they refused to change their mind. They clung to the irrational decision and kept finding all kinds of bogus reasons why their choice was preferable. In other words, they weren't just irrational, they were stubbornly irrational. And these were the top economists in the world. This led to the creation of a whole new subfield of economics called behavioral economics. And the main founders of this all got Nobel Prizes in economics. My idea was I would look at classical rationalist translation studies like Andrew Chesterman and compare that with the kind of translation studies that I like to do, which is hermeneutical and is not so focused on rational choices or irrational choices, but on how human beings make sense of things. Hermeneutics, right? Studying interpretation. And I would use behavioral economics as a kind of way of organizing a hermeneutical approach to translational choices. What happened though was I found an article by a woman named Michelle Chihara pointing out that behavioral economics was a good old boy club, that all of the behavioral economists were male. And what they were basically doing from her point of view was redefining or reframing masculinity economically. So in classical economics, the male decision maker is basically Enlightenment man. The upper class, often aristocratic white males in Europe who ran everything back then in the 18th century. They were the rational ones. That was the image of masculinity, right? It's good to be rich, powerful, white, and male, right? All of those. Then you can call how you think rational. And compare that with the behavioral economists who were all about making mistakes and realizing mistakes and exploring mistakes and so on. And so the image of masculinity in behavioral economics, according to Michelle Chihara, was the ordinary guy, the ordinary husband and father, a middle-class guy who means well. He's not some sort of master of the universe. He's just an ordinary guy, but he's still very masculine and still excluding women from purview. So I said, I can't really just do what I was planning. What I was planning was the same kind of old boys club that Michelle Chihara was pointing out. And so I expanded it to include econs, the imaginary rational males, humans, the behavioral economic men's, but divide humans into masculine humans, feminine humans, and queer humans, picking up the queerness from my transgender book. And that came out last year. Then questions for translation studies, which I was the product of a teaching situation. I was teaching Anthony Pym's Exploring Translation Theories to my MA students at CUHK Shenzhen. And there were numerous moments in that semester. This would have been 2 years ago. No, 2 years ago. Numerous moments where we came upon a question that we couldn't answer. Either Pym raised it and couldn't answer it, or it occurred to me and I couldn't answer it, or a student asked it and nobody could answer it. And so I started thinking about those questions and jotting them down, and that eventually turned into this book, Questions for Translation Studies, published by John Benjamins last year. And what I did was to take 3 key moments, key words in equivalence theories, semantic equivalence, dynamic equivalence, and deverbalization, then 3 keywords in descriptive translation studies, norms, laws, and narrator or narratoriality, and then a conclusion. and just ask a series of questions. It's a classical genre called cuestiones, where you make an argument in the form of questions and answers. So you ask a question, you answer it. The answer provokes another question, and you proceed that way, but as a kind of ongoing Q&A. I wrote another monograph on a Finnish author. Aleksis Kivi was Finland's greatest 19th century author, the founder of Finnish literature, and Volter Kilpi was Finland's greatest modernist author. So I wrote that book called Translating the Monster, Volter Kilpi, and Orbit Beyond Untranslatability. And then the sixth book, primary translation was also 2023. It was a kind of research handbook. The sixth book in 2023 was the beginning of a new approach for me, experimental translation. I wrote this book called The Experimental Translator. There's a short monograph published with Paul Grave Macmillan. And then that didn't satisfy me, so I wrote two other books on experimental translation. They're both forthcoming this year. The first one is called Translator Touretter, as in Tourette syndrome. And the subtitle of that is Avant-Garde Translation and the Touretter Sublime. That's coming out of Brill. And the third one on experimental translation is called Lessons Experimental Translators Can Learn from Finnegan's Wake, Translating That Gas Wind into Turfish. And that is a short, all three of those are short monographs. And the Joyce one is coming out from Routledge. I also have a full monograph coming out this year called Translating the Non-Human, What Science Fiction Can Tell Us About Translation. And since I'm speaking to Poland, I thought I would mention that in that book on science fiction, I mentioned I have three American science fiction novels, Samuel Delaney's Babel 17, Suzette Hayden Elgin's book, Native Tongue, and The Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang, which was made into the movie Arrival. That's right. But in the course of that, I do talk some about Stanislas Lem's Saliaris. I'm not sure whether that's how you pronounce it in Polish. I've only seen the Tarkovsky movie, and also read the novel, of course. And in Russian, of course, you say Saliaris. My situation right now, after 21 years at the University of Mississippi, 10 years at Hong Kong Baptist University, first 3 years as dean, and then 7 years as a chair professor of translation, intercultural studies, and translation, interpreting, and intercultural studies. I am now professor of translation studies. I had to retire from HKBU at 65, and now I'm halfway through my fourth year at Chinese University of Hong Kong, Shenzhen, as professor of translation studies, and we are in our second year of a PhD program, which is very exciting. We brought in our first cohort a year and a half ago, and there were 5 of us supervisors, and we were able to choose 5 supervisees. And the young woman that I chose was a former MA student of mine, absolutely brilliant. I'm thrilled to be supervising her, and we're just bringing in getting our second year, the first year cohort of the second year this year, and we are gearing up to recruit our third year cohort now for next September.